I knew the HOA in my town was bad, but this? This was a whole new level of insanity. I had just pulled up to my farm after running some errands when I saw the most ridiculous thing imaginable. White folding chairs were set up in neat rows right in the middle of my field. A floral arch stood at the edge of the pond, ribbons flapping in the breeze. A crowd of well-dressed guests milled around, sipping champagne. A string quartet played softly under a massive white tent, and oh, this was the kicker, there was a full buffet table set up near my barn. I wasn't invited. I wasn't even told. Someone had decided that my farm was the perfect venue for their wedding. Without asking. Without paying. Without so much as a courtesy call. And I had a pretty good idea who was behind it. Olivia Masters, the HOA president and self-appointed ruler of our neighborhood, stood near the buffet in a ridiculous lilac dress, barking orders at a caterer. Her perfectly coiffed blonde hair didn't move in the wind, and her lips curled into a permanent expression of disapproval, as if she were constantly judging the world around her. I parked my truck and marched straight toward her. "Olivia!" I called, my voice carrying over the music. She turned, clearly startled to see me, but quickly recovered, pasting on a fake smile. "Oh, hello! Isn't it just a lovely day for a wedding?" "Yeah, it is. Too bad it's happening on my property." I crossed my arms, glaring at her. "Care to explain why there's a wedding on my farm without my permission?" She had the audacity to wave a dismissive hand. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. It's just one little event. You weren't using the land for anything important today, were you?" I clenched my jaw so hard my teeth ached. "That's not the point, and you know it. You can't just take over someone's property." "Oh, come now," she said, as if I were being unreasonable. "It's for my niece, and she needed a beautiful outdoor venue. The HOA agreed your farm was the perfect spot." "The HOA?" I nearly laughed. "The HOA doesn't own my land, Olivia." "I do." She waved me off again and turned back to the caterer. "Make sure the shrimp stays on ice. We don't want any food poisoning." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my temper in check. This woman had been an absolute menace since she took over the HOA board. She fined people for the smallest infractions, forced ridiculous rules on homeowners, and acted like she owned the entire neighborhood. But this was outright trespassing. I glanced around. The guests were oblivious, chatting and laughing as if nothing was wrong. The bride, a young woman in a pearl-encrusted gown, stood near the pond, posing for photos. Olivia wasn't going to listen to reason. Fine. She wanted to treat my farm like it was her personal wedding venue? Then I'd give her a real farm experience. I turned on my heel and strode toward the barn, where my goats were lounging in the shade. I had raised them since they were tiny, and they were clever, mischievous little creatures. They also had an unstoppable appetite for anything they could get their teeth on. I opened the gate, whistled, and stepped aside. The goats perked up. Then, as if sensing mischief, they trotted out of the barn, heading straight for the buffet. It took all of 5 seconds for chaos to erupt. The goats wasted no time. Their hooves clattered against the wooden deck as they closed in on the untouched buffet, their eager eyes locked onto the platters of expensive catered food. The first to make his move was Jasper, my most cunning troublemaker. He leapt effortlessly onto the table, his hooves knocking over a tray of delicate hors d'oeuvres. Gasps and shrieks filled the air as the other goats followed suit. Within seconds, a full-on buffet raid was underway. A particularly bold goat named Daisy shoved her snout directly into a giant silver bowl of fruit salad, sending chunks of pineapple and grapes flying. Edgar, my biggest goat, used his impressive weight to topple a chafing dish, spilling steaming pasta all over the pristine white tablecloth. A woman in an elaborate blue hat shrieked as a goat grabbed a napkin straight out of her hand and chewed it like it was the best meal of his life. Olivia's horrified scream cut through the chaos. She was frozen in place, eyes darting between the destruction and the panicked caterers desperately trying to shoo the animals away. But goats don't shoo. They take. They conquer. One of the caterers, a lanky guy in a black vest, made the grave mistake of trying to push Jasper off the table. Jasper, not one to be manhandled, simply leapt onto the man's back as if he were a convenient stepping stone and launched himself onto another table. The momentum sent a towering wedding cake tilting dangerously to one side before it tumbled, landing with a splat on the grass. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The bride, who had been obliviously posing by the pond, turned at the sound of destruction. The moment her gaze landed on the ruined cake, her face contorted with sheer outrage. She lifted the hem of her elaborate dress and stormed toward the wreckage, her heels sinking into the grass with every furious step. "What is happening?" she shrieked, her carefully styled curls bouncing with each word. Her eyes darted to the goats, then to the guests scrambling to avoid them, and finally, to Olivia, who stood as still as a statue, her face pale. That was when the groom arrived, running from the other side of the yard, his tuxedo jacket flapping behind him. He skidded to a stop next to his bride, his expression torn between shock and barely contained laughter. One of my goats, Stella, had somehow grabbed a long white tablecloth between her teeth and was now sprinting across the yard, dragging it behind her like a flowing cape. Plates, glasses, and silverware clattered to the ground in her wake. The bride let out a strangled cry. "Aunt Olivia! What is going on?" Olivia finally snapped out of her daze, her expression morphing into barely controlled fury. She spun toward me, her eyes blazing. "You did this on purpose!" she hissed. I crossed my arms. "You're right. I did. Because this is my farm, Olivia. You and your little wedding party decided to trespass, so I decided my goats should enjoy the party too." The bride let out a horrified gasp. "Trespass?" She turned on Olivia. "You said we had permission." Olivia's jaw tightened. "I assumed he wouldn't mind." The bride looked like she was about to explode. "You assumed?" She threw up her hands. "Are you insane?" "We spent months planning this." The groom, who was still failing to suppress his laughter, cleared his throat. Sweetheart, maybe we should." "No." The bride spun to face me. "Sir, please, isn't there anything we can do?" "I'll pay you. I swear, just please make the goats stop." I pretended to think about it, tapping my chin. Well, considering the fact that nobody asked me for permission before setting this all up, I'm not feeling particularly generous today." Olivia stepped forward, her face contorted in fury. "You can't be serious. Do you have any idea how much money went into this wedding?" I gave her a level stare. "Do you have any idea how illegal it is to use someone else's property without permission?" That shut her up. The bride, on the verge of tears, turned to the groom. "Oh my God! This is a disaster." Meanwhile, my goats were still having the time of their lives. Daisy had somehow managed to climb onto a chair and was happily munching on the remnants of a baguette. Edgar was now tangled in a string of decorative lights, dragging them behind him like some kind of bizarre parade float. The guests, most of whom had abandoned their seats, were now gathered in small groups, whispering amongst themselves. Some were filming the chaos on their phones. The groom exhaled slowly and rubbed his temples. "Okay," he said, turning to me. "Look, I get it. This was really messed up. We should have gotten permission. I had no idea this was happening like this." He shot a glare at Olivia. "But please, is there any way we can fix this?" I studied him. He seemed like the only reasonable person here. Finally, I sighed. "The only way I'd even consider letting this continue is if you and your bride personally clean up every bit of this mess after the wedding. And Olivia pays me double what this land would have cost to rent." The groom nodded immediately. "Done." The bride hesitated for a second, then sighed. "Fine. Whatever. I just want to get married." All eyes turned to Olivia. Her face turned bright red. "You can't be serious. I'm not paying." The bride cut her off, her voice low and dangerous. "Aunt Olivia, you lied to me. You ruined my wedding. If you don't pay him, I swear to God, I will never speak to you again." Olivia's mouth snapped shut. For a long moment, she simply stood there, fists clenched. Then, with a sharp inhale, she turned to me and spat. Fine. I grinned. Great. Now if you'll excuse me. I let out a loud whistle. The goats, as if conditioned to respond, perked up. One by one, they trotted back toward the barn, their bellies full and their mischief complete. The wedding could go on. But Olivia? She had just learned a very expensive lesson. The wedding continued, but the mood had shifted. Guests who had once been laughing and enjoying their champagne were now eyeing the scattered remnants of their ruined meal with uncertainty. A few brave souls tried to salvage what they could from the buffet, but most gave up after spotting hoof prints in the spilled salad and bite marks on the bread. The bride and groom stood together near the pond, speaking quietly while the photographer attempted to adjust their poses to hide the lingering chaos. Olivia, however, was nowhere to be seen. After reluctantly agreeing to pay me, she had stormed off toward the parking area, likely trying to compose herself before facing her family again. I took a deep breath, surveying the aftermath. My goats had returned to their enclosure, content and full, but the evidence of their raid was everywhere. The once pristine white tablecloths were stained and torn, the cake was still an unrecognizable mess on the ground, and several chairs had been knocked over in the commotion. A few members of the catering staff were huddled together, whispering furiously. One of them, a woman with dark hair pulled into a tight bun, finally marched over to me, her expression tight with frustration. She introduced herself as the catering manager and wasted no time getting to the point. They had been hired under the assumption that this was a legitimate venue, and now they were stuck dealing with the fallout. She wanted to know if I intended to take any legal action, as her company had not been informed that the property was being used without permission. I assured her that my issue was with Olivia, not them. They had been misled just as much as I had. She nodded, clearly relieved, before turning back to her team to salvage what they could. Not long after, Olivia reappeared, her expression carefully composed, but the tension in her posture betrayed her anger. She walked straight toward me, stopping just short of invading my personal space. Her voice was low and controlled, but there was venom beneath the surface. She accused me of humiliating her in front of her family, of ruining her niece's special day. She insisted that if I had simply let the wedding proceed without interference, everything would have been fine. I didn't bother arguing. I simply gestured at the destruction around us and asked her how she thought this was going to end. Did she really believe I would just allow a full-scale event on my property without consequences? Her nostrils flared, but she didn't respond. She knew she had no defense. The bride approached next, her expression weary. She apologized for the situation, explaining that she had trusted Olivia to handle everything. She hadn't realized the venue arrangements had been made without my consent. I could see the frustration in her eyes, not just at the disaster her wedding had become, but at the realization that someone she trusted had caused it. The groom, standing beside her, gave Olivia a pointed look before muttering something to his wife. She nodded, and together they walked away, leaving Olivia standing there, seething. The cleanup process began soon after. True to their word, the bride and groom, along with a few reluctant guests, started picking up the mess. The catering staff, clearly eager to be done with the ordeal, worked quickly to pack away what little was salvageable. As I watched, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. Olivia had spent years using the HOA as her personal tool for control, issuing fines and enforcing ridiculous rules with an iron fist. But today, she had finally faced consequences of her own making. She had assumed she could take what she wanted without asking. She had been wrong. And now, as she stood there, watching her carefully orchestrated event unravel, she knew it too. With the wedding limping along in the aftermath of the goat invasion, I took a step back, watching as the once pristine setup was now a patchwork of salvaged decorations and hastily rearranged chairs. The bride and groom had managed to pull themselves together, now standing under the floral arch while the officiant hurried through the ceremony, likely aware that the guests were eager to move past the chaos. Olivia, however, was still fuming. She stood stiffly near the back, arms crossed so tightly her fingers dug into her sleeves. She wasn't speaking to anyone, and from the way even her own relatives were avoiding her, it was clear she'd lost whatever respect she had among them. As the officiant pronounced the couple married, a polite but subdued round of applause followed. Nobody dared to comment on the lingering scent of goat, or the fact that several guests were still brushing bits of hay from their expensive outfits. Even the photographer looked exhausted, muttering instructions to the newlyweds as they posed for a few final pictures. I could have left it at that, let Olivia stew in her disgrace, but something told me she wasn't done causing trouble. She had spent too many years lording over the neighborhood, using the HOA as a weapon, to simply accept defeat. Sure enough, as the guests began trickling toward their cars, Olivia made her move. She marched toward me with a forced air of authority, her heels sinking into the damp earth with every step. Without preamble, she informed me that she would be reporting me to the HOA board for disrupting a community event. She claimed that my actions had been reckless, that unleashing my goats had endangered the guests, and that there would be consequences. I didn't even try to hide my amusement. I reminded her, in no uncertain terms, that this wasn't HOA property. My farm was entirely outside their jurisdiction, and if she wanted to press the issue, she'd be the one facing legal trouble for trespassing and unauthorized use of private land. Her expression darkened, but before she could respond, another voice cut in. The bride had returned, her once pristine dress now stained at the hem from the grass and dirt. She looked exhausted but determined, her gaze locked onto Olivia with something dangerously close to contempt. In a calm but firm tone, she informed Olivia that their family had decided to remove her from all future event planning. She made it clear that Olivia's overreach had cost them dearly, not just financially, but in trust. For the first time all day, Olivia looked genuinely shaken. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The realization that she had lost control, that her own relatives were turning against her, left her momentarily speechless. I took the opportunity to drive the point home. I let her know that I would be sending her an invoice for the use of my land, including additional charges for damages and cleanup. If she refused to pay, I would have no problem taking legal action. A flicker of panic crossed her face, quickly masked by forced indifference. Without another word, she turned on her heel and stormed away, disappearing into the dwindling crowd. As the last of the guests departed, I took one final look around. The farm had seen better days, but it would recover. The goats had certainly enjoyed themselves, and in the end, Olivia had been forced to face the consequences of her arrogance. It wasn't the ending she had expected, but it was exactly the one she deserved. With the last of the guests gone, the only sounds left on the farm were the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant bleating of my goats, still lounging contentedly in their enclosure. The mess they'd left behind was undeniable: scattered decorations, overturned chairs, and trampled grass where the buffet had once stood. The catering crew had done their best to clean up, but there was only so much they could do in the fading light. The bride and groom had kept their word, staying behind to help with what they could. The groom hauled collapsed tables back toward the parking area while the bride, now barefoot, gathered what remained of the discarded flower arrangements. They worked in silence, exchanging only the occasional glance as they moved through the wreckage of what should have been the most important day of their lives. I walked past the remnants of the wedding arch, its once elegant drapery now tangled and stained with dirt. The wind had knocked over one of the decorative lanterns, its glass shattered in the grass. Nearby, a few abandoned champagne flutes sat half full, forgotten in the chaos. Despite everything, I had to admit they had put effort into the setup. If only Olivia had done the one thing that would have made it all legitimate: asked permission. As I approached the barn, the bride called out to me. She set down the broken bouquet in her hands and wiped her palms against the ruined fabric of her dress before closing the distance between us. She didn't look angry anymore. Just exhausted. She told me she understood why I had done what I did. That while she had been furious in the moment, now that the adrenaline had worn off, she could see how absurd the whole situation had been. She admitted she had trusted Olivia blindly, believing she had secured a proper venue, and she regretted not questioning it sooner. The groom joined us, wiping sweat from his brow. He apologized for everything, saying he had no idea his wedding had been built on deception. He made it clear he wasn't just embarrassed, he was furious with Olivia. He planned to make sure his family knew exactly how much trouble she had caused. I told them both I appreciated their honesty, that I had nothing against them personally, but I couldn't let something like this slide. Property rights were property rights. If Olivia had pulled this stunt on someone else, the consequences could have been much worse. The bride sighed, glancing toward the darkening sky. She admitted she didn't know how to face her family after this. That her wedding, the day she had spent months planning, had become a story people would tell not for its romance, but for the sheer absurdity of it all. The groom, trying to lighten the mood, joked that at least it would make for a memorable anniversary story. The bride gave him a tired look before shaking her head. She wasn't convinced. I told them that at the very least they had learned something valuable: how people reveal their true selves when put under pressure. Olivia had shown them exactly who she was, and now they knew better than to trust her again. The groom nodded, saying that Olivia had always been a force in their family, but this was the first time she had truly crossed the line. He had already spoken to a few relatives, and the general consensus was that she had finally gone too far. The bride, rubbing her temples, muttered that she didn't even want to think about the fallout. I glanced toward the farmhouse, noticing the porch light flickering on as the evening settled in. It had been an exhausting day for all of us. I told them they'd done their part, and they should go home and get some rest. They hesitated for a moment before agreeing. The bride thanked me again, saying that despite everything, she was glad I wasn't holding a grudge. The groom promised to make sure Olivia followed through with the payment, even if he had to handle it himself. I watched as they walked toward their car, the bride leaning slightly against the groom, their energy completely drained. Once they were gone, I turned back to the mess. I still had work to do, but for the first time all day, the farm was quiet. At least, until I heard the sound of a car door slamming. I turned to see Olivia standing beside her vehicle, arms crossed, her expression unreadable in the dim light. I had assumed she had left with the others, but clearly, she had unfinished business. She walked toward me, stopping just a few feet away. Her face was still flushed from anger, but her voice was quieter than before. She told me I had no idea how much I had embarrassed her. That I had made her look like a fool in front of her family, humiliated her in a way she might never recover from. I told her she had done that to herself. She flinched, but recovered quickly, insisting that I could have handled things differently. That I could have just let the wedding happen and dealt with it after. I asked her why she thought she was entitled to my land in the first place. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked past me, toward the remnants of the wedding, before exhaling sharply. She admitted she had gotten carried away. That she had wanted the wedding to be perfect for her niece, and when she saw my farm, she knew it was the right place. She didn't think I would say yes if she asked, so she didn't ask at all. I told her that was exactly the problem. She didn't argue. Instead, she pulled a checkbook from her purse, scribbled something onto a slip, and held it out to me without a word. I took it, glancing at the amount. It was double the usual rate for renting out land for an event, just as I had demanded. She turned to leave, but before she reached her car, she hesitated. She told me this wouldn't be the last time we crossed paths. I told her I wasn't afraid of that. With that, she got into her car and drove off, leaving me standing in the quiet, check in hand, the weight of the day finally settling in. I looked around at my farm, the land she had tried to claim as her own, and shook my head. She had learned a lesson today. But something told me Olivia Masters wasn't the type to stay down for long. The night was unusually still after the storm of chaos that had unfolded. The warm glow of my farmhouse porch light cast long shadows over the remnants of the wedding, illuminating the knocked-over chairs and trampled decorations. The caterers had taken what they could, but a few discarded napkins and forgotten champagne flutes still littered the ground. I stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of it all. Olivia had left, but something told me she was already plotting her next move. That woman didn't take humiliation lightly, especially not when it was so thoroughly deserved. Shaking off the thought, I turned toward the barn, where the goats had settled in for the night. Daisy, the ringleader of the earlier buffet raid, was lying near the entrance, her belly full, her eyes half-lidded in contentment. Edgar, the largest of the bunch, let out a deep sigh and flopped onto his side, his work for the day complete. I chuckled softly, giving Jasper a quick scratch between the ears before heading inside. The farmhouse was quiet, the air thick with the scent of wood and the faint trace of coffee from earlier that morning. I set Olivia's check down on the kitchen table and stared at it for a long moment. It wasn't about the money. It never had been. It was about the principle. The fact that she thought she could take without asking, assume without permission, and wield her role in the HOA like some kind of crown. That was what had pushed me to act, and that was why I knew this wasn't over. Olivia wasn't the type to learn from her mistakes, she was the type to double down. The next morning, I woke to the sound of a car pulling up the gravel driveway. My first thought was that Olivia had returned, ready to spit more venom, but when I stepped onto the porch, I was greeted by a different sight entirely. 3 men in dark suits stood near a sleek black sedan, their expressions unreadable. One of them, a middle-aged man with graying hair, adjusted his tie before stepping forward. He introduced himself as Richard Calloway, an attorney representing the HOA. I wasn't surprised. Olivia had wasted no time calling in reinforcements. Richard, in a voice as smooth as polished steel, informed me that the HOA had concerns about the incident that had taken place on my property. He gestured vaguely toward the remnants of the wedding, as if reluctant to acknowledge the absurdity of it all, and explained that there had been complaints. I raised an eyebrow, crossing my arms as I leaned against the porch railing. Complaints from whom? The bride and groom had already accepted responsibility. The only person who had a problem with how things had played out was Olivia. Richard hesitated before continuing. The HOA, he claimed, was considering legal action for reckless endangerment. Olivia had apparently spun a story about how my animals had attacked the wedding, causing undue distress and potential harm to the guests. I couldn't help but let out a short, incredulous laugh. The goats hadn't attacked anyone. They had raided a buffet, stolen tablecloths, and knocked over a wedding cake, but unless someone had a particularly dramatic fear of livestock, there hadn't been any real danger. I asked Richard if he had actually spoken to anyone besides Olivia about what had happened. His silence answered that for me. He was here as a formality, a scare tactic meant to rattle me into compliance. Olivia had likely called him in a fury, demanding legal action, and he was doing his due diligence before telling her there was nothing to pursue. I decided to cut to the chase. I informed him that I had security cameras on my property, cameras that had captured every moment of the wedding from the setup that happened without my permission to the goats gleefully wreaking havoc. If Olivia wanted to take this to court, I would be more than happy to provide the footage. And while we were at it, I would be sure to press charges for trespassing, property damage, and unauthorized use of my land. Richard's expression shifted slightly. He asked if I was willing to come to some kind of agreement. I told him we already had one. Olivia had written me a check. If she wanted to escalate things, I would be more than happy to involve the authorities instead. There was a long pause before Richard exhaled sharply and nodded. He muttered something about needing to reassess the situation, and promised to follow up. I knew what that meant. He was going to tell Olivia to stand down. Sure enough, 2 days later, I received an email from the HOA's legal office stating that, after careful review, they had decided not to pursue any further action. Olivia had lost. Not just the battle, but the war. Word had spread quickly through the neighborhood about what had happened. People who had once lived in fear of Olivia's iron grip on the HOA were starting to talk about her abuse of power, her entitlement, and now, her spectacular failure. I ran into the bride's parents a few days later at the local farmer's market. They were still embarrassed about the whole mess but assured me that Olivia was facing serious backlash from the family. She had been removed from all future event planning, just as the bride had promised. But more than that, some of the HOA board members had started questioning whether Olivia was fit to lead at all. The final nail in the coffin came when a petition began circulating to have her removed as HOA president. Within a week, nearly every homeowner in the neighborhood had signed it. By the end of the month, Olivia had been officially voted out. It was poetic justice. She had spent years using her position to control others, to bend the neighborhood to her will, but in the end, her own arrogance had been her undoing. I heard through the grapevine that she had sold her house and moved out shortly after. She couldn't handle the humiliation of losing her throne. As for me, life went back to normal. The farm recovered, the grass grew back, and the goats, ever the troublemakers, continued their usual antics. Every now and then, I'd catch sight of a wedding announcement in the local paper and chuckle to myself, wondering if the bride and groom had learned their lesson about trusting Olivia. But in the end, I didn't need to dwell on it. Justice had been served, and my land, my home, was mine once more.